Eurasian countries seem uneasy living off the land, and their policymakers have longed for the day when their economies are no longer dependent on natural resources. They've tried to put away some of their earnings from oil and natural gas sales for future generations, and they have spent significant amounts of public money to foster economic diversification. But is forced diversification the right prescription for economic success? Joining us in the studio to discuss this is Dr. Ivailo Izvorski from the World Bank, where he is the manager of macroeconomics concerning Europe and Central Asia. Welcome, Dr. Izvorski.
Thank you very much, sir. Pleasure to be here.
Well, it's good to have you here. Let me ask you first, Doc, why are the efforts of policymakers in these countries to diversify? In fact, according to the World Bank, these efforts have actually led to less diversification in these economies.
Well, thank you again for having me. And the report we are discussing is a report on diversified development, how to make the best of natural resources in Eurasia. In it, we focus on the 6 resource-rich countries of Eurasia and the 6 resource-poor ones, and we compare them with other sets of countries around the world in order to be able to draw conclusions about whether development has been, in a way, if you will, creating jobs, reducing volatility, enhancing employment. And so the question you ask comes right directly into this debate. How is it that over the last 20 years, all countries in Eurasia, whether resource-poor or resource-rich, have done much better in terms of creating jobs, in terms of raising living standards, in terms of reducing poverty?
But they're not diversifying. Curiously,
so
right?
All the indicators that governments care about, are people employed? Are living standards rising? Are people happier? Is poverty down? All of these indicators are much better. They're not diversified. And so this concentration of both exports and in some cases production comes, in a way, if you will, in contrast to this. And so, but it is only in contrast to this if you think of diversification as an objective for government policymakers. And one of our main points in the report is that diversification is not the main objective for policymakers. The main objectives are better living standards, improved job security, better education, better health. And so diversification often is seen as a proxy for economic development. And we argue here that the diversification of exports and the diversification of economic production should not be the main concerns of policymakers. Their main concern should be, how do we make it possible for these jobs to continue to be created? How do we make possible for productivity in economy to rise?
So with that in mind, why have Eurasian policymakers for so long tended to equate development and diversification?
And so I think here we come that diversification is a useful concept, but here we argue, and I think very persuasively, that it is the diversification of the factors of production, what we call endowments, right? What we call the assets of these countries that are the important, right, target for the diversification efforts. So countries that have natural wealth, all the natural wealth completely dominating their national wealth, they have to diversify that national wealth, the composition of this national wealth, into more intangible assets, such as institutions, such as the quality of education, such as the quality of infrastructure. And once you have a better diversification of these assets, the productive assets, then you would have a better living standard, more jobs, higher pay, and perhaps you may have even a diversification in the old format.
So this is an interesting point. I read your report, and you make this point that Russia and some of the former Soviet Union countries need to invest in these different types, these non-physical type institutions, education, early education, and healthcare, and in government programs. But, as you look at the United States and the United Kingdom, they have increased their per capita incomes tenfold since 1870. This is what you write. And have, of course, diversified exports. But Australia and Canada's economies, meanwhile, have also grown into highly developed economies, but their exports remain specialized. So how come some countries develop highly developed economies and have these diversified exports, while others also become highly developed but don't have a diversified set of exports?
It's an excellent question. And this is precisely why, when we look at facts like that and some others in the report, we come to the conclusion that there doesn't seem to be any linkage between the diversification of production and diversification of exports and economic development. Some countries are diversified and developed, some countries are not diversified and developed. Some countries are very diversified and not developed. Even in Eurasia, of course, you have countries that are very diversified. Some of those that are resource poor have a very diversified export and production structure, but they're not very developed. And so we don't see much evidence anywhere in the world of a link between the diversification of exports and economic development. But what we do see is a huge link between the diversification of assets. Instead of having so much of your national capital, the wealth of the nation, concentrated in natural resources. In Eurasia, this is almost 50%. Governments should try to create the incentives and work towards diversifying these assets. In the middle-income countries around the world that are resource-rich, and these include Russia and Kazakhstan, but in the other middle-income countries around the world that are resource-rich, about 60% of the national wealth is in these intangibles. And they're intangibles because we cannot touch them, but they're actually very clear when we see them. These are the institutions that, one, regulate economic activity, make it transparent and clear for businesses what they should expect, make it easier for them to compete and not to be poised against vested interests. Two, these are the institutions, and again, they're intangible because these are arrangements and policies, right? They're not necessarily physical structures, but these are the institutions that deliver public services, whether it's education, whether it's health, the most important one of those, or even public utility services. And three, these are the institutions that actually manage resource volatility. These are the fiscal rules, right? What are the rules for the budget? And Russia, of course, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, all of these countries have these fiscal rules. What are the rules for the budget? How do you invest money in this resource fund that you keep abroad typically? How do you take money out of it? And so these are these three types of institutions that actually come to us as the main conclusion. What distinguishes successful resource-rich countries from those that are not very successful?
Well, let's look at a few examples. In the report, not to beat a dead horse, but in the report you mentioned Canada in 2010's per capita income was 85% that of the United States'. Argentina's had fallen to 35%. Brazil's GDP has stagnated at 20% relative to the United States for more than a century. How did Canada remain so very concentrated in its exports, yet manage to achieve such a high per capita income compared to the United States?
And again, I think the point of departure here is to say that there doesn't seem to be much correlation between how diversified your exports are and how well you do economically, right? One does not correlate with the other. And so therefore, we have Canada, very concentrated exports, but a very well-developed economy. Why? In Canada, if you look at the structure of national wealth, institutions, right? These rules that I was just talking about, how to manage resource volatility, how to deliver education, health, other public services, and how to ensure this transparent and clear business environment have been very strongly developed. And so Canada ranks very highly together with Australia, together with the United Kingdom, together with the United States, Norway, on, for example, the ease of doing business. You take resource-rich countries in the world, the successful ones, they are ranked on average 15th by ease of doing business. The countries of Eurasia, the resource-rich countries of Eurasia, rank much lower, close to 90th position. And so it is essentially these institutions, right? These institutions, together with a quality of education, quality of infrastructure, and that delivers the mix of assets that ultimately determine whether you do well economically or not. And so, you know, if you read the report, and I'm going to maybe preview some of your other questions that I'm sure are going to follow.
Yeah.
The key conclusion here is the key distinction between successful and unsuccessful resource-rich countries. And you can imagine there's so many resource-rich countries in the world that are not very successful. The key distinction is this: have we harnessed these institutions And I know in Russian this doesn't translate very well. Translates as instituty.
Well, a lot of our listeners speak English, so it's not a problem.
Fantastic.
Translation.
But institutions, precisely these three types of institutions, and emphasis on them early in the development process, that ultimately determines this success from
Let me ask
failure.
you this, Doctor. Some have asked, and you address this in your report, how you can smooth out the ups and downs of a resource-based economy. And how do you do that?
There's so much or so little to smooth out. Obviously, countries that depend a lot on natural resources, and all of these do, including the resource poor Eurasia, depends a lot on natural resources, both directly and indirectly. It is not easy to eliminate the influence of commodity prices. The best you can do is try to limit the fluctuation of certain variables over the business cycle, the business cycle, ups and downs. And the best we can do, and economic literature tells us that the best we can do is try to smooth the path of government spending. We should not be trying to smooth out the business cycle itself. It would take a lot of spending. It would not always be productive. It would have negative consequences. But the best we should do is try to smooth government spending. Keep government spending broadly unchanged, or much better, if you can do it, counter-cyclical against the business cycle. And that's why we have these fiscal rules and the resource funds that should help you achieve this stabilization of government spending objective.